Every morning, as the sun climbed over the 7 hills and cast long shadows across the marble facades of the Palatine, a ritual older than the emperors themselves began to unfold. It was called the salutatio, the formal morning greeting, and it was the beating heart of Roman political life. Clients, freedmen, minor aristocrats, and aspiring politicians gathered in the atria of the great houses, waiting for their moment to approach their patron. And when that moment came, they did not simply bow, they did not shake hands, they kissed, mouth to mouth. It sounds bizarre to modern ears, almost intimate in a way that clashes with our understanding of public formality. But in Rome, the kiss was currency. It was respect made flesh, loyalty performed on the lips, a bodily contract renewed each dawn. To refuse the kiss was to reject the relationship itself. To offer it poorly, hesitantly, with averted eyes, was to insult the patron and mark oneself as unreliable. And so, day after day, hundreds of Romans pressed their mouths together in the name of honor, duty, and survival. But honor has a cost, and in imperial Rome, that cost was beginning to show itself in the most grotesque ways imaginable.
The problem was not the tradition itself, but the biology it ignored. Romans lived in a world without germ theory, without antiseptics, without even a proper understanding of contagion. They knew that disease could spread. Hippocratic texts and Roman medical manuals acknowledged as much, but they did not know how. They believed in miasmas, in bad air, in the wrath of gods. They did not believe that a senator's breath could carry death. And yet, it did. Halitosis was epidemic among the Roman elite. Dental hygiene, as we understand it, barely existed. The wealthy chewed on mastic gum and rinsed their mouths with wine or vinegar, but these measures were superficial at best. Tooth decay was rampant. Gum disease festered in the mouths of men who controlled legions and provinces. Abscesses went untreated until they burst, filling the mouth with pus and rot. And every morning, these same men leaned in close and kissed their clients, their peers, their subordinates, and sometimes their emperor. The satirist Martial captured the horror with brutal clarity. In his epigrams, he mocked men whose breath could kill a viper or wilt flowers at 10 paces. He wrote of one patron whose morning greeting left clients gagging, fleeing into the street to vomit. Another poet joked that certain Romans needed to be greeted from across the room, lest their exhalations prove fatal. These were not mere insults. They were warnings, cloaked in humor because the truth was too uncomfortable to state plainly. Rome's greeting culture was making people sick.
Doctors noticed it too. Galen, the most famous physician of the 2nd century, wrote extensively about oral diseases and their spread. He described infections passed from person to person through saliva, though he lacked the language to explain bacteria or viruses. He recommended that patients avoid close contact with the sick, but in a society where close contact was a requirement of citizenship, his advice went largely ignored. Other medical texts from the period mention kiss plague, a term used loosely to describe any illness that seemed to spread through gatherings and formal visits. Modern historians have speculated that these outbreaks could have been anything from influenza to herpes simplex, from streptococcal infections to early forms of tuberculosis. Whatever the cause, the result was the same. Senators were falling ill, and the rituals that bound Roman society together were being blamed. The aristocracy began to panic. These were not common laborers or slaves dying in anonymity. These were men of power, men whose health determined the fate of provinces and armies. When a senator collapsed during a debate in the Curia, when a consul retired early due to mysterious fevers, when an imperial advisor developed lesions around his mouth and could no longer eat, these were not private tragedies, they were political crises. And they all seemed to begin the same way, with a kiss. The psychological dimension of this crisis cannot be overstated. Romans were obsessed with honor, with the performance of virtue, with the visible demonstration of loyalty. To greet a patron without the kiss was to declare oneself his enemy. To greet him with the kiss, knowing his breath reeked of infection, was to gamble with one's life. The aristocracy found itself trapped between two fears, the fear of dishonor and the fear of death. And for a society that prided itself on stoic courage, on enduring pain without complaint, this was an unbearable humiliation.
Men began to dread the morning salutatio. They invented excuses to delay their visits. They sent slaves in their place, hoping their patrons would not notice the substitution. Some resorted to crude solutions, holding their breath during the kiss, turning their heads at the last second, pressing their lips together so tightly that no exchange of moisture could occur. But these tactics were risky. A patron who felt slighted could withdraw his support, cutting off a client's income, reputation, and political future. And so most men simply endured, closing their eyes and leaning in, hoping they would not be the next to fall ill. The situation was absurd. It was medieval. It was in every sense a crisis born of cultural inertia. A society too proud to change, too bound by tradition to acknowledge that its rituals were killing its elite. And at the center of this madness sat an emperor, watching as his senate withered, watching as his court physicians grew desperate, watching as the very structure of Roman patronage began to rot from within. Something had to be done. But what? How you ban a kiss without banning Rome itself?
The emperor, whose identity remains debated among modern historians, though most evidence points to Tiberius during his later, more reclusive years on Capri, was not a man given to impulsive decisions. He was calculating, paranoid, and deeply aware of how easily power could slip away. He had seen emperors rise and fall on the strength of public perception, on the loyalty of the Senate, on the favor of the mob. He understood that tradition was the glue holding the empire together, and yet tradition was now poisoning his government. The reports began arriving with increasing frequency. A senator named Lucius Piso, a man in his 50s with a distinguished military record, had collapsed during a morning salutatio. He had been greeting clients in his atrium when he suddenly clutched his chest, coughed violently, and staggered backward. Blood appeared on his lips. Within days, he was dead. The official cause? A sudden fever. The unofficial whispers? He had been infected during the greeting rituals, perhaps by a client with a hidden illness, perhaps by another senator whose breath carried disease. Another senator, Quintus Caecilius, developed painful ulcers around his mouth. They began as small sores, but spread rapidly, cracking and bleeding whenever he spoke. Court physicians examined him and concluded that the infection had been introduced through repeated contact with others, most likely through kissing. Caecilius withdrew from public life, humiliated and in agony. His absence destabilized several key legislative negotiations, and his political allies began to panic.
Then came the incident that changed everything. During a diplomatic reception, the emperor himself was approached by a visiting ambassador from Germania. The man, eager to demonstrate his respect for Rome's customs, leaned in for the traditional greeting. The emperor, who had been briefed by his physicians on the dangers of such contact, instinctively recoiled. The ambassador froze, his face reddening with confusion and anger. The room fell silent. Had the emperor just refused the diplomatic greeting? Had he insulted a foreign envoy in front of the entire court? The emperor recovered quickly, offering his hand instead and explaining, vaguely, diplomatically, that he had been advised to limit physical contact due to a minor ailment. The ambassador accepted the explanation, but the damage was done. Word spread through the palace. The emperor was afraid of kisses. The emperor, the most powerful man in the known world, was dodging his own subjects like a frightened child. The palace staff, meanwhile, were reaching their own breaking point. Dozens of people visited the emperor each day. Military commanders, provincial governors, senators seeking favor, foreign diplomats, religious officials, and countless petitioners hoping for an audience. Each one expected the traditional greeting. Each one leaned in, mouth open, breath stale with wine and garlic and the accumulated filth of a society that did not yet understand microbiology. The emperor's personal attendants, freedmen tasked with managing access to his person, began to complain. One servant reportedly told a court physician that he would rather face a gladiator than endure another morning of kiss duty. The physicians themselves were growing desperate. Galen's writings suggest that doctors at the imperial court were acutely aware of the connection between close contact and disease, even if they could not explain the mechanism. They warned the emperor that the greeting culture was unsustainable, that it was only a matter of time before he himself became ill. They pointed to the senators who had already fallen, to the rising number of infections, to the growing fear among the aristocracy. They begged him to act.
But what could he do? To ban the kiss outright would be to attack the foundation of Roman social life. The salutatio was not just a greeting, it was the mechanism by which power flowed through Roman society. Patrons protected clients. Clients supported patrons. The kiss sealed the deal. Without it, how would loyalty be demonstrated? How would alliances be forged? How would Rome function? And yet, the alternative was equally unthinkable. If the emperor did nothing, the Senate would continue to sicken. More men would die. The aristocracy would lose faith in his leadership. Enemies would seize on the crisis, claiming that the emperor cared more about tradition than the lives of his own senators. The empire's reputation, both domestically and abroad, would suffer. The emperor found himself trapped. Every option seemed to lead to disaster. Then came the rumor that tipped the scales. It was said, though never confirmed, that a senator had been deliberately infected, that a political rival, knowing the man attended a particularly crowded salutatio, had sent a client with a contagious illness to kiss him. The senator fell ill within days and died within weeks. Whether this was true or merely paranoid speculation, it did not matter. The idea had taken root. The kiss was no longer just dangerous, it was weaponizable. The emperor convened an emergency meeting with his closest advisors. The debate lasted hours. Some argued for caution, warning that any interference with Roman customs would be seen as tyranny. Others demanded immediate action, pointing to the mounting death toll. One advisor, a former military commander, suggested that the emperor frame the issue as a matter of national security. If senators could be assassinated through kisses, then the entire government was vulnerable. That argument won the day. The emperor made his decision. He would issue a decree, not banning the kiss entirely, but restricting it, regulating it, transforming it from a biological hazard into a controlled sanitary gesture. He would present the law as a health reform, a necessary modernization of Roman customs in the face of a new and insidious threat. He would appeal to reason, to science, to the greater good. He had no idea what he was about to unleash.
The edict was announced on a humid morning in late summer, read aloud by a herald in the forum, and posted on the walls of the curia. It was brief, almost clinical in its language, but its implications were staggering. By order of the emperor, Formal mouth-to-mouth kissing was henceforth banned in all official settings: the Senate, the imperial palace, public ceremonies, and diplomatic receptions. Citizens were encouraged to adopt alternative forms of greeting: hand clasps, cheek kisses, or respectful bows. Those who violated the decree would face no legal punishment, but they would be denied access to the emperor's presence and could be barred from senatorial proceedings. The reaction was immediate and chaotic. In the Senate, older conservatives erupted in outrage. This was an assault on mos maiorum, the ancestral customs that defined what it meant to be Roman. The kiss was not just a gesture, it was a symbol of continuity, a link to the Republic, a tradition passed down through generations. To abandon it was to abandon Rome itself. One senator, a man named Gaius Cassius Longinus, stood before the assembly and declared that he would rather die with honor than live under a government that regulated how men greeted one another. His speech was met with applause, though notably, several senators kept their distance when he approached them afterward.
In the streets, the decree became instant fodder for satire. Street poets composed crude verses mocking the emperor for ruling over breath and lips. Graffiti appeared on walls throughout the city. The emperor fears kisses. Rome's greatest enemy, halitosis. One particularly clever artist drew a caricature of the emperor wearing a face mask made of laurel leaves, shielding himself from a line of senators with exaggerated rotten teeth. But beneath the jokes, there was genuine confusion. How was the decree supposed to work? Who would enforce it? Palace guards were trained to protect the emperor from assassins, not to monitor the type of kisses exchanged between senators. Would there be kiss inspectors? Would someone stand in the Senate and shout, "Illegal greeting," every time two men leaned in too closely? The practical problems were immense. Roman social life was built on physical contact. Patrons and clients kissed, senators kissed, military commanders kissed, even slaves, when greeting their masters in certain contexts, might offer a respectful peck. To untangle all of these interactions, to determine which kisses were acceptable and which were banned, was an administrative nightmare. The emperor attempted to clarify the decree in a follow-up statement. He emphasized that the ban applied only to formal, ceremonial, and official contexts, not to private life. Friends could still kiss, family members could still kiss. The decree, he insisted, was aimed at preventing the spread of disease in crowded, high-stakes environments where senators and officials gathered in close quarters. He even commissioned a pamphlet, distributed by court physicians, explaining the medical reasoning behind the law. The pamphlet cited examples of documented illnesses linked to greeting rituals, quoted Galen's warnings about contagion, and urged citizens to embrace modern hygiene practices for the good of the empire.
But the damage was done. The decree had crossed the line. It had taken something deeply personal, the way Romans touched, the way they demonstrated loyalty, the way they connected, and turned it into a bureaucratic regulation. And Romans did not like being told how to love, how to honor, or how to kiss. The backlash was swift and multifaceted. Ambassadors from allied kingdoms expressed confusion and offense. In many cultures, the Roman greeting kiss was seen as a mark of respect, a gesture that acknowledged Rome's superiority. To suddenly change the rules felt like an insult, a suggestion that foreign dignitaries were somehow unclean. One ambassador from Parthia reportedly refused to attend a scheduled meeting with the emperor, sending word that he would not grovel like a peasant by offering a hand instead of a proper Roman kiss. Clients, meanwhile, felt humiliated.
For centuries, the morning salutatio had been their moment of recognition, their chance to be seen, acknowledged, and valued by their patrons. The kiss was proof of the relationship. Without it, what were they? Strangers? Servants? The ritual lost its meaning. Some clients stopped attending altogether, choosing instead to send gifts or written messages. Patronage networks, the invisible threads that held Roman society together, began to fray.
Senators, despite their public complaints, were privately relieved. Many had been terrified of the morning greetings, of the foul breath and festering mouths they were forced to endure. The decree gave them permission to avoid the kiss without dishonoring themselves. They could blame the emperor, shrug, and offer a hand instead. But even this relief was tinged with resentment. They had not asked for the law. They had not voted on it. The emperor had acted unilaterally, and that set a dangerous precedent. And then there were the rebels. A small but vocal group of aristocrats began organizing what they called loyalty-kissing circles, private gatherings where participants deliberately exchanged mouth-to-mouth kisses as a form of defiance. These meetings were framed as celebrations of tradition, of Roman identity, of resistance against imperial overreach. Attendees swore oaths of secrecy and mocked the emperor's decree as the act of a coward. Some even claimed that the kiss plague was a myth, a fabrication designed to justify tyranny. The market responded with predictable opportunism. Merchants began selling kiss-safe products, perfumes, breath powders, herbal lozenges, and even primitive mouth rinses made from crushed mint and wine. Advertisements appeared in public spaces promising to restore your Roman greeting or make your kiss legal again. One enterprising apothecary claimed to have developed a paste that, when applied to the gums, would neutralize all corruption and allow for traditional greetings without fear. Whether these products worked was irrelevant. They sold by the cartload. The no-kiss decree had become more than a health measure. It was a symbol of change, of imperial power, of the tension between tradition and survival. And as spring turned to summer, as the heat intensified and tempers flared, it became clear that the crisis was far from over.
By the time autumn arrived, the no-kiss decree had transformed from a public health policy into a full-blown cultural war. Rome had always thrived on debate, on the clash of ideas in the forum in the Senate, but this was different. This was personal. The emperor had not simply changed a law. He had altered the way Romans touched each other, and in doing so, he had struck at the heart of what it meant to be Roman. The conservative faction in the Senate, led by men like Gaius Cassius Longinus and Marcus Junius Silanus, framed the decree as an existential threat to Roman identity. They argued that mos maiorum, the way of the ancestors, was not merely a collection of customs, but the foundation of Roman greatness. The Republic had been built on these traditions. The empire had been forged by men who honored their fathers, their gods, and their patrons with the kiss. To abandon it now, they argued, was to betray the very soul of Rome. Silanus, a former consul with a voice that could fill the curia, delivered a blistering speech that was later transcribed and circulated throughout the city. "The emperor asks us to replace our mouths with our hands," he thundered. "He asks us to greet one another like merchants, like foreigners, like men who have forgotten where they came from. But we are Romans. We do not bow to fear. We do not rewrite our history because a physician whispers in the emperor's ear. If disease is the price of honor, then let us pay it with pride."
The speech was met with roaring applause, though notably Silanus himself had been one of the first senators to adopt the hand-clasped greeting in private. Still, his words resonated. They captured the anger, the confusion, and the deep sense of loss that many Romans felt. The decree had taken something intangible, something cultural, something sacred, and reduced it to a medical problem. And that reduction felt like an insult. The satirists had a field day. Juvenal, the sharpest and most vicious poet of the age, composed an entire satire mocking the decree. In it, he imagined a future Rome where citizens were forbidden from breathing in public, where lovers required imperial permission to embrace, and where even prayer was regulated by the state. He described senators wearing golden masks to protect themselves from one another, and an emperor so terrified of germs that he lived in a sealed chamber, communicating only through written messages. The satire was performed in taverns and read aloud in bathhouses, and with each retelling, the emperor's reputation suffered another blow. Graffiti became a weapon of political resistance. On the walls of the Subura, Rome's most crowded and chaotic neighborhood, someone painted a crude image of the emperor fleeing from a giant pair of lips. Another graffiti artist wrote in neat Latin script, "Tiberius trembles before what senators once conquered, a kiss." Near the Curia itself, someone scrawled, "The Senate kisses in secret, the emperor rules in fear." But the most dangerous backlash came not from poets or graffiti artists, but from within the aristocracy itself.
The loyalty-kissing circles grew in number and influence. What had begun as a handful of defiant nobles sharing wine and trading stories had evolved into a semi-organized movement. These gatherings were held in private villas, away from the eyes of palace informants, and they quickly took on a ritualistic quality. Participants would arrive after dark, greet one another with exaggerated mouth-to-mouth kisses, and spend the evening discussing the emperor's failures. Some circles composed mock decrees of their own, banning ridiculous things, sneezing in public, laughing too loudly, standing too close to a statue of Jupiter, to illustrate the absurdity of regulating human behavior. The emperor's spies reported back, and the reports were deeply unsettling. The circles were not just social clubs, they were breeding grounds for dissent. Members swore oaths of loyalty to one another, pledging to resist any further imperial overreach. Some even discussed more radical actions, boycotting imperial ceremonies, refusing to attend Senate sessions, or publicly defying the emperor by kissing in front of the palace gates. The movement was small, but it was growing, and it was becoming increasingly hostile. Merchants, meanwhile, continued to profit from the chaos. The market for breath improvement products exploded. Apothecaries sold lozenges made from crushed anise, mint, and honey, promising to restore traditional greetings. One particularly clever entrepreneur began offering kiss insurance, a service where clients paid a monthly fee in exchange for access to court physicians if they fell ill after a greeting. The service was almost certainly a scam, but desperate Romans, caught between tradition and fear, paid for it anyway.
Some products crossed the line from opportunism into outright fraud. A merchant in the Forum advertised a divine breath tonic that he claimed had been blessed by the Vestal Virgins. Another sold amulets that supposedly protected the wearer from kiss plague. The aediles, Rome's market regulators, tried to crack down on the most egregious frauds, but enforcement was nearly impossible. The city was in chaos, and the kissing crisis had become a profit opportunity for anyone willing to exploit it.
The backlash was not confined to Rome. In the provinces, local aristocrats heard about the decree and reacted with a mixture of confusion and amusement. Some saw it as further evidence of the capital's decadence, proof that Roman elites had grown soft and cowardly. Others worried that the decree might be enforced beyond the city itself, that they too might be forced to abandon their own greeting customs. Provincial governors sent letters to the emperor asking for clarification. Were they expected to implement the no-kiss policy in their regions? If so, how? And what would happen if they refused? The emperor, reading these reports in his private chambers, must have felt the weight of the crisis bearing down on him. What had seemed like a simple, rational solution, a medical intervention to protect his Senate, had spiraled into a political disaster. He was being mocked in the streets, defied by the aristocracy, and questioned by his own governors. The decree had not solved the problem, it had only made it worse. And then, disaster struck.
The breaking point came during a diplomatic reception in late autumn. The emperor, attempting to restore Rome's international reputation after months of domestic turmoil, had invited ambassadors from across the empire and beyond to a grand ceremony at the palace. It was meant to be a display of Roman power and unity, a reminder to the world that Rome, despite its internal squabbles, remained the dominant force in the Mediterranean. But the event was doomed from the start. The first sign of trouble came when the ambassador from the kingdom of Pontus arrived. Pontus, a client state in Asia Minor, had long maintained close ties with Rome, and its king prided himself on honoring Roman customs. The ambassador, a dignified man in his 60s named Mithridates, entered the reception hall with full ceremonial dress and approached the emperor's dais. Protocol dictated that he would offer the traditional Roman greeting, a mouth-to-mouth kiss, as a sign of respect and submission. But the emperor's attendants, briefed on the no-kiss decree, blocked his path. They explained, politely but firmly, that the emperor was no longer accepting such greetings. They gestured toward a cushion where the ambassador could kneel and offer his hand instead.
Mithridates froze, his face flushed crimson. The room fell silent. "You insult Pontus," he said, his voice shaking with barely controlled rage. "You insult my king. You insult me." The emperor's advisers scrambled to defuse the situation. One offered a diplomatic explanation. The emperor had been advised by physicians to limit physical contact, purely as a precaution. Another suggested that the ambassador could offer a cheek kiss instead, a compromise between tradition and hygiene. But Mithridates would not be placated. "I came here to honor Rome," he said, his voice echoing through the hall, "and Rome treats me like a leper." He turned and walked out. His entourage followed. The reception descended into whispered chaos. Word of the incident spread through the city within hours. Satirists had a field day. One poet composed a verse in which Pontus declared war on Rome not over territory or tribute, but over the sacred right to kiss. Another imagined the emperor cowering behind his throne, terrified that a foreign ambassador might breathe in his direction. The mockery was relentless. But the damage went beyond satire. Pontus was a critical ally, and its king was already frustrated with Rome's demands for tribute. The ambassador's humiliation gave him a perfect excuse to sever diplomatic ties. Within weeks, Pontus began withholding payments to Rome and openly courting alliances with Parthia, Rome's greatest rival in the east. What had begun as a hygiene policy was now threatening Rome's geopolitical stability. Inside the Senate, the crisis finally boiled over.
Gaius Cassius Longinus, the conservative senator who had been the decree's loudest critic, called for an emergency session. He stood before the assembly, his voice dripping with fury, and delivered what many considered the most important speech of his career. "We are Romans," he began. "We conquered the world not through cowardice, not through hiding behind physicians and edicts, but through courage and honor. Our ancestors kissed their patrons, their generals, their emperors, not because it was safe, but because it was right. And now we grovel. Now we offer our hands like merchants. Now we insult our own allies because we are afraid of breath." He paused, letting the words hang in the air. "The emperor has overstepped. He has forgotten that Rome is not a hospital. Rome is a civilization, built on tradition, on loyalty, on the bond between men. If we abandon that bond, if we let fear dictate our customs, then we are no longer Romans. We are something else, something lesser." The Senate erupted in applause. Even senators who had privately supported the decree found themselves clapping, caught up in the moment. It was a masterclass in rhetoric, a speech that appealed not to reason, but to emotion, to pride, to the deep well of anxiety that every Roman felt about the empire's future. The emperor's allies tried to respond, but their arguments fell flat. One senator, a physician himself, stood and attempted to explain the medical basis for the decree. He cited statistics, documented cases of illness linked to greeting rituals, testimony from doctors, warnings about contagion. But the Senate did not want statistics. They wanted clarity. They wanted leadership. And they wanted their emperor to stop treating them like diseased animals. The session ended in deadlock. No vote was taken, no resolution was passed, but the message was clear. The Senate would not accept the no-kiss decree indefinitely. Outside the Curia, tensions continued to escalate. A client, emboldened by the Senate's defiance, attempted to kiss his patron during a morning salutatio. Palace guards, interpreting the act as a violation of the decree, physically removed the man from the premises. The client protested, arguing that the law applied only to official settings, not private homes. The guards disagreed. A scuffle broke out. The client was dragged into the street where a crowd had gathered. Rumors spread that he had been beaten, imprisoned, or worse. Within hours, a mob formed outside the Curia. Hundreds of Romans, clients, freedmen, even a few lower-ranking senators demanded answers. They chanted slogans, "Let Rome kiss," "Down with the breath police," "The emperor fears his own people." The city's urban cohorts were called in to disperse the crowd, but the situation teetered on the edge of violence. Rome, for the first time in years, felt like it was on the brink of a riot. The emperor, watching from his palace, realized that he had lost control of the narrative. The no-kiss decree, intended as a rational public health measure, had become a symbol of tyranny, overreach, and imperial paranoia. His enemies were using it to undermine his authority. His allies were abandoning him. And worst of all, the decree had not even solved the original problem. Senators were still falling ill. Infections were still spreading. And the greeting culture continued to pose a health risk. Something had to change.
The emperor did not formally repeal the no-kiss decree. To do so would have been a humiliating admission of failure, a signal to his enemies that he could be pressured into retreat. Instead, he did what Roman emperors had always done when faced with an unwinnable conflict. He compromised, quietly, and let the situation evolve on its own. In a carefully worded public statement issued through his magistrates and posted throughout the city, the emperor acknowledged the concerns raised by both sides. He reaffirmed the medical reasoning behind the decree. Disease was real, contagion was dangerous, and the health of the Senate mattered.
But he also conceded that Roman customs deserved respect. The decree, he announced, would remain in place for official ceremonies and imperial audiences, where the risk of mass infection was highest. But in private settings, among friends and family, Romans were free to greet one another as they wished. It was a masterful piece of political theater. The emperor had not surrendered, but he had given his critics enough space to save face. The conservatives could claim victory. The decree had been softened, tradition had been defended. The emperor's supporters could point to the policy's survival. Official greetings were still regulated, hygiene standards remained. And the general public, exhausted by months of chaos and mockery, was simply relieved that the crisis seemed to be ending.
But the real changes happened not in the decree itself, but in the culture it had disrupted. The no-kiss crisis had forced Romans to confront something they had long ignored, the connection between ritual and health. For centuries, the greeting kiss had been unquestioned, a sacred tradition passed down from the Republic. But the emperor's decree, however clumsily implemented, had shattered that illusion. Romans could no longer pretend that their customs were above scrutiny, that honor could justify any risk, that tradition was immune to the realities of biology. And so, slowly, the culture shifted. Senators and aristocrats began to adopt alternative greetings without being forced. The cheek kiss, once considered foreign and effeminate, became acceptable in formal settings. Hand clasps grew more common. Some men even adopted the Eastern custom of bowing slightly, a gesture that conveyed respect without physical contact. These changes were subtle, almost imperceptible at first, but they accumulated. Within a generation, the mouth-to-mouth greeting that had once defined Roman social life had faded into obscurity, remembered only in old poetry and satirical texts. The market for hygiene products, meanwhile, exploded. The no-kiss crisis had created an entire industry. Romans who had once ignored their breath now sought remedies. Apothecaries sold mint-infused rinses, herbal chews, and breath-sweetening pastilles. Dentists, rare in earlier periods, became more common, offering crude extractions and abscess treatments. Wealthy Romans began commissioning bronze tongue scrapers and ivory toothpicks, tools that had previously been considered foreign luxuries. Hygiene, once an afterthought, became a mark of sophistication.
The cultural shift extended beyond the elite. In the crowded insulae of the Subura, in the bustling markets of the Forum, ordinary Romans began to adopt the same habits. Barbers started offering breath consultations alongside shaves. Bathhouses advertised their use of fresh mint and rosewater. Even slaves, who had little access to medicine or luxury goods, began chewing on wild herbs to mask bad odors. The emperor's decree, for all its flaws, had inadvertently modernized Roman attitudes toward the body. Patronage rituals also transformed. The morning salutatio, once a daily obligation for clients, became less frequent. Patrons, wary of crowded atria and the risk of infection, began limiting the number of visitors they received. Some replaced the physical greeting with written correspondence. Clients would send notes expressing their loyalty, and patrons would respond with gifts or favors. This shift weakened the personal bonds that had sustained the patronage system, but it also made the system more efficient. Romans learned that loyalty did not require proximity, that honor could be demonstrated through action rather than touch. The Senate, predictably, resisted these changes. Conservative senators continued to grumble about the erosion of tradition, the rise of foreign customs, and the emperor's supposed cowardice. But even they could not deny the results. The wave of illnesses that had plagued the aristocracy in the years before the decree began to subside. Senators lived longer. Fewer men collapsed during debates. The curia, once a breeding ground for infection, became safer. Historians would later look back on the no-kiss crisis as a bizarre footnote in Roman history, a moment when the empire's obsession with tradition collided with the emerging realities of public health. Modern scholars have debated whether the decree was a success or a failure. On one hand, it provoked massive backlash, diplomatic crises, and near riots. On the other hand, it forced Romans to rethink their approach to hygiene, accelerated the adoption of safer greeting practices, and may have saved countless lives. The truth, as with most historical questions, is complicated. The no-kiss decree did not end disease in Rome. It did not transform the empire overnight. But it did something more subtle and more significant. It broke the spell of tradition. It forced Romans to admit that their customs, however ancient and sacred, were not infallible. It opened the door to change, to questioning, to the slow, grudging acceptance that survival sometimes requires sacrifice, even the sacrifice of a kiss. For the emperor, the crisis was a Pyrrhic victory. He had achieved his goal. Senators were no longer falling ill at the same rate, but at a tremendous cost. His reputation never fully recovered. Satirists continued to mock him for years. Future generations would remember him not for his military victories or administrative reforms, but for the absurd decree that tried to regulate Roman lips.
And yet, in the privacy of his chambers, reading reports of declining infection rates and healthier senators, the emperor may have allowed himself a small, bitter smile. He had been right. The kiss had been dangerous. Tradition, unchecked, had been killing his government. And though he had paid a heavy price for intervening, though he had endured mockery and rebellion and political disaster, he had done what emperors are meant to do. He had acted. Rome survived. The Senate endured. And somewhere in the back alleys of the Suburra, in the marble atria of the Palatine, in the bustling markets of the Forum, Romans leaned in to greet one another, not with their mouths, but with their hands, their cheeks, their voices. They had adapted. They had changed. They had survived. And that, in the end, was the most Roman thing of all.
The no-kiss decree remains one of the strangest episodes in Roman history, a crisis that should never have happened, but somehow did. It reveals the deep tension at the heart of Roman civilization, the conflict between tradition and survival, between honor and pragmatism, between the past and the future. Rome was a society built on rituals, on the careful performance of loyalty, respect, and continuity. But rituals, like everything else, can become obsolete. They can become dangerous. And when that happens, societies must choose, adapt or die. The emperor who banned kissing understood this. His decree was clumsy, his execution flawed, his political instincts questionable. But he saw the problem that others refused to acknowledge. He recognized that Rome's greatest strength, its devotion to tradition, was also its greatest weakness, and he had the courage, or perhaps the recklessness, to act. The backlash he faced was brutal and predictable. Romans hated being told how to behave, especially by an emperor who seemed more concerned with hygiene than honor. But in the end, the culture shifted. Not because the emperor forced it to, but because the crisis exposed a truth that Romans could no longer ignore. Tradition, however sacred, is not worth dying for.
The no-kiss decree did not save the Roman Empire. It did not prevent its eventual collapse, did not halt the slow decay that would consume the western provinces, did not stop the barbarian invasions or the economic crises or the political instability that defined Rome's later centuries. But it did something quieter and more profound. It planted the seeds of change. It showed Romans that their customs could evolve,
that their society could adapt, that survival sometimes required the courage to let go. And in that sense, the emperor's bizarre, mocked, and misunderstood decree may have been his greatest legacy, a reminder that even in the eternal city, even in the heart of an empire that claimed to be timeless, nothing lasts forever. Not traditions, not rituals, not even a kiss.